There was a time when the Atlantic was not a highway. It was a war. A vast stretch of water separating the people of West Africa from whatever lay beyond the horizon. For most people, there was no reason to challenge it. But one ruler of the Great Mali Empire wanted to know what was on the other side. We do not know his name with complete certainty. History often calls him Abu Bakr II. But the oldest surviving account of his voyage does not give him that name. What it does tell us is extraordinary. According to the Egyptian historian and writer Al-Yuma, the ruler once sent a large fleet into the Atlantic. Hundreds of ships sailed west. They were supposed to return with news of what they had found. But one by one, they disappeared. Only one ship eventually came back. The captain told the ruler that the fleet had encountered something strange in the ocean. A powerful current. It looked, he said, almost like a river flowing through the sea. The other ships had entered it. And they never returned. For most rulers, that might have been enough. The ocean had given its warning. But this ruler was not satisfied. He prepared another expedition. This time, the account says, the fleet was enormous. 2,000 ships. Some carried people. Others carried food, water, and supplies. And then came the part that would turn the story into a mystery lasting for centuries. The ruler decided to go with them. The ship sailed west and disappeared beyond the horizon. If you enjoy stories like this, stories that take us into the forgotten corners of African history, where the evidence is sometimes clear and sometimes buried beneath centuries of mystery, subscribe to the African Archive. Because there are still many African stories waiting to be uncovered. And this is one of them. He never returned. Years later, another ruler sat in Cairo telling the story. His name was Mansour Musa. He would become one of the most famous rulers in African history. But when he spoke about the man who had ruled before him, he was not talking about gold. He was talking about an expedition. A fleet that had vanished into the Atlantic. Centuries later, Europeans would cross that same ocean and begin a new age of global conquest and exchange. And that is where the mystery begins. Because some have wondered whether the ships from Mali went further than anyone has been able to prove. Could they have reached the Americas? Are there clues buried in the archaeological record? Could the plants, metals, and stories of the pre-Columbian Americas tell us something? Or is this simply the story of an extraordinary expedition that disappeared at sea? We know the voyage was reported. We know the ruler never returned. But we do not know where the ships went. And before we decide whether they reached another continent, we must first understand the empire that sent them. This is the story of Mali's forgotten voyage, and the mystery beyond the horizon. Chapter 1. The empire behind the horizon. Long before anyone in Europe imagined an Atlantic world connected by ships, there was a powerful empire growing in West Africa. Its name was Mali. At its height, Mali stretched across a large part of West Africa. Its rulers controlled important lands and trade routes. Its merchants moved between cities, markets, rivers, and desert crossings. And beneath all of this was something that made Mali famous far beyond its borders. Gold. But gold alone did not create the empire. People did. Farmers cultivated the land. Blacksmiths worked iron into tools and weapons. Craftsmen produced leather goods and other valuable products. Merchants traveled long distances with caravans. Boatmen moved people and goods along the Niger River. Scholars gathered in places where books and ideas were exchanged. Mali was part of a much larger world. Its connections reached across the Sahara into North Africa and the Islamic world. Salt came south. Gold moved north. Horses, cloth, books, and other goods traveled along the same networks. Information traveled too. A merchant returning from a distant market could bring news from places that ordinary people might never see. For the rulers of Mali, the world was therefore much larger than the land immediately around them. They knew about distant kingdoms. They knew about deserts that seemed endless. They knew about the great cities of North Africa. And to the west was another frontier. The Atlantic Ocean. The empire had access to the coast through territories under Malian influence. But an ocean is different from a road. A road tells you where it leads. The Atlantic did not. It stretched toward the horizon, hiding whatever lay beyond it. And yet Mali was not an empire cut off from the wider world. Islam had become deeply established among its ruling class and many of its cities. Scholars traveled. Books traveled. Ideas traveled. The pilgrimage routes connecting West Africa to North Africa and the Middle East carried people across enormous distances. The wider world was no longer simply something heard about in distant stories. It was becoming something Mali's rulers could experience for themselves. Then came the reign of Mansa Musa. His famous pilgrimage to Mecca would eventually make Mali known across the Islamic world. But Mansa Musa was not the beginning of Mali's power. He inherited an empire that had already been built over generations. And somewhere in that powerful kingdom was a ruler who looked at the Atlantic differently. To others, it was simply an enormous body of water. To him, it may have represented a question. What lies beyond it? We have to be careful here. We do not know exactly what was in that ruler's mind. The surviving sources do not give us his private thoughts. But we know what he reportedly did. He sent ships west. And that decision tells us something important. The history of medieval Africa was not confined to what happened on land. Africans traded across deserts. They traveled along rivers. They crossed borders. They followed religious and commercial routes thousands of kilometers from home. And at least according to the surviving account, one Malian ruler decided to push even further. Toward the open ocean. That is where his story begins. But before he could become the man who disappeared into the Atlantic, he had to become a king. And this is where the mystery becomes even more complicated. Because the man we call Abu Bakr II may not have been Abu Bakr II at all. To understand the voyage, we first have to understand the man behind it. Chapter 2. The king who wanted to know. The man at the center of this mystery is usually known as Abu Bakr II. But that name comes with a warning. The oldest surviving account of the Atlantic expedition does not actually name the ruler Abu Bakr II. The name comes from later efforts to reconstruct the succession of Mali's rulers. So, throughout this story, we should remember something important. We know more about what this ruler reportedly did than we know about the man himself. That makes his story unusual. There are no long surviving writings from him explaining his dreams. No diary telling us why he wanted to explore the Atlantic. No speech describing what he expected to find. Instead, we have fragments. Historical accounts. Names. Succession traditions. And one extraordinary story passed down to a later ruler. The ruler who reportedly launched the expedition came before Mansa Musa. And according to the tradition preserved in the historical record, he had already reached the highest position in one of the most powerful states in West Africa. He had wealth. He had authority. He had soldiers. He had access to merchants and scholars who connected Mali with a much wider world. He could have spent his reign strengthening the empire he had inherited. Instead, something drew his attention toward the Atlantic. Perhaps it was curiosity. Perhaps it was the desire to expand knowledge. Perhaps there were stories of lands beyond the sea. We cannot know for certain. But the decision he made tells us that the Atlantic was not simply a boundary in his mind. It was an invitation. And that was a dangerous way to think. Because sailing along a familiar coast is one thing. Sailing away from land with no guarantee that you will ever see it again is something else. The first expedition appears to have been an attempt to find out what lay beyond the known waters. According to Al-Yuma, the ruler sent hundreds of ships into the Atlantic. The fleet sailed west. The ruler waited. Days passed. Then more days. The ships did not return. Eventually, one vessel came back. Its captain had survived. And what he told the ruler would change the course of the story. The captain described a powerful current in the ocean. His companions had entered it. They continued forward. And then they disappeared. The ruler now had a choice. He could accept that the ocean had defeated them. Or he could try again. He chose the second option. That decision is perhaps the most revealing thing we know about him. Whatever his reasons were, failure did not convince him to abandon the question. It made the question larger. What was beyond the current? Where had the ships gone? Was there land? Was there another coastline? Or was there simply more ocean? We should pause here. Because this is where modern retellings often rush ahead. They tell us that the fleet reached America. But the historical evidence does not give us that answer. The source tells us that the expedition was launched. It tells us that the ships disappeared. It tells us that the ruler followed with a second expedition. It does not tell us where they ended up. That uncertainty is not a weakness in the story. It is the story. And it leaves us with a remarkable image. A powerful African ruler standing at the edge of the known world. Knowing that the first attempt had failed. And still choosing to sail west. The second expedition would be far larger. And this time, the ruler would not remain behind. He would go with it. Thousands of ships would soon disappear beyond the horizon. And the next time we hear of the man who ordered them to sail, he is gone. Chapter 3. 2,000 ships. The second expedition was different. The first had been a test. Now the ruler was preparing for something much larger. According to the account recorded by Aluma, the ruler ordered a massive fleet to be assembled. The number he gives is extraordinary. 2,000 ships. Some were said to carry people. Others carried supplies. Food. Water. And everything the expedition would need for a journey whose length no one could predict. We should remember that this number comes from a medieval historical account. We cannot independently confirm that exactly 2,000 ships were built. But the report is important because it tells us how the expedition was remembered. This was not described as a small group of fishermen drifting away from the coast. It was presented as a royal undertaking on an enormous scale. And then came the most important decision. The ruler would not stay behind. He would go with them. Imagine the scene. Along the coast, boats are being prepared. Men are loading supplies. Crews are gathering. The sea stretches out in front of them. Behind them is everything they know. The cities of Mali. Their families. Their markets. Their farms. Their homes. Ahead is nothing they can see. The fleet begins to move. One ship. Then another. And another. Until the coastline is filled with vessels. Then the ships begin moving westward. At first, they are still within reach of the world they know. But eventually the land becomes smaller. Then distant. Then disappears. The fleet continues. And somewhere ahead is the same ocean that had swallowed the first expedition. This time, there would be no returning captain to report what happened. Because the ruler himself was on board. The ship sailed into the Atlantic. And then, nothing. No surviving record tells us where they went. No account tells us that they reached another coastline. No surviving Malian document describes their arrival anywhere. The ruler simply disappears from the historical record. And when the story resumes, someone else is sitting on the throne. His name was Manso Musa. Manso Musa would become famous throughout the Islamic world. In 1324, he traveled to Mecca on a pilgrimage that would make the wealth of Mali famous in places far beyond West Africa. But when Manso Musa later spoke about the ruler who came before him, he gave an explanation for how he had become king. His predecessor had gone west. He had sent ships into the Atlantic. And he had never returned. This account was eventually recorded by Aluma. It is one of the most important pieces of evidence we have for the story. But it leaves us with a problem. The ships disappeared. That's all we can say with confidence. Maybe they were destroyed by storms. Maybe they ran out of food or fresh water. Maybe the crews could not navigate back. Maybe they reached an island. Maybe they reached another continent. Or perhaps the expedition never traveled as far as later generations imagined. We simply don't know. And this is where the story becomes tempting. Because the Atlantic does lead somewhere. If a vessel travels west from West Africa, there are currents and winds that can carry it toward the Americas. The distance is enormous. The journey would have been dangerous. But it was not physically beyond the reach of the ocean. And that raises the question that has fascinated historians, researchers, and ordinary people for generations. Did the fleet reach the Americas? Before we answer that question, however, we have to understand the ocean itself. Because if the Atlantic could not carry medieval ships from Africa to the Americas, the mystery ends here. But if it could, then the disappearance of those ships becomes even more interesting. The next question is not whether Molly wanted to cross the Atlantic. It is whether the Atlantic could actually be crossed. Chapter 4. What the ocean could carry. Before we ask whether the Molian fleet reached America, we have to answer a simpler question. Could a ship from West Africa reach the Americas at all? The answer is important. Because if the Atlantic made such a journey impossible, then there would be little reason to investigate the story further. But the Atlantic is not a motionless wall of water. It moves. Winds push across its surface. Currents carry water over enormous distances. And along the coast of West Africa, one of those currents flows westward. The North Equatorial Current moves across the tropical Atlantic toward the Caribbean. For a modern ship, this is simply part of ocean navigation. But for a small sailing vessel, currents could become a powerful force. A crew did not always have to know the entire ocean to be carried across it. They needed a vessel that could stay afloat. They needed supplies. They needed favorable conditions. And, most importantly, they needed to survive. That last part is where the difficulty begins. Crossing the Atlantic is not the same as drifting across a river. The distance is enormous. A crew would need enough food and fresh water to survive for weeks. They would have to deal with storms, illness, damage to the vessel, navigation problems, and the constant danger of becoming separated from the rest of the fleet. Even if one vessel reached land, that would not mean an entire expedition had succeeded. This distinction matters. A voyage can be physically possible without being historically proven. And there is another question. What kind of ships did West Africans use? West African societies had long traditions of fishing, river transport, and coastal movement. Along the Atlantic coast, people understood the sea. They knew how to build and operate boats suited to their environment. But the ships used for coastal or river travel were not automatically designed for a prolonged open ocean expedition. We should therefore be careful. It would be wrong to say West Africans had boats, so they could easily cross the Atlantic. They could not simply sail into the ocean without serious risk. But it would also be wrong to say medieval Africans could not cross the Atlantic. The ocean does not care who built the ship. It responds to wind, currents, weather, navigation, and the ability of the vessel and its crew to survive. And there is one fact that makes this mystery even more interesting. The Atlantic has carried living things across itself for thousands of years. Seeds, plants, animals, and, eventually, human beings. So the physical connection between Africa and the Americas is not in doubt. The question is when human beings crossed it, how they crossed it, and who they were. This is where we must resist another temptation. It is easy to look at the map and draw a straight line. West Africa is here. The Caribbean is there. The current flows west. Therefore, the Molian fleet must have arrived. But history does not work that way. A map can show us what is possible. It cannot tell us what actually happened. And this is the problem that will follow us through the rest of this investigation. There are things that could have happened. There are things that may have happened. And there are things we can actually prove happened. Those are three very different things. The Atlantic tells us that a westward journey was physically possible. But it does not tell us whether the ships of Molly completed that journey. For that, we need evidence. Something that survived the ocean. Something that survived the centuries. A plant. A piece of metal. An object. A human story. Something that can connect two worlds. And over the years, researchers have pointed to several clues. Some are fascinating. Some are misunderstood. And some have nothing to do with Molly at all. So now, we leave the ocean behind and follow the clues that may, or may not, connect medieval Africa to the Americas. Chapter 5. The clues across the Atlantic. If the Molian ships really reached the Americas, we might expect something to remain. Not necessarily a monument. Not necessarily a written record. Even a small object could change the story. A plant. A tool. A piece of metal. Something that crossed the Atlantic and left a trace behind. And over the years, several clues have been presented as evidence of contact between Africa and the Americas before Columbus. Some are real. But real evidence does not always prove what people claim it proves. The first clue takes us back thousands of years. It is something surprisingly ordinary. A bottle gourd. The bottle gourd originated in Africa. Yet varieties of the plant were present in the Americas long before Europeans arrived. At first, that sounds like exactly what we are looking for. An African plant. In the Americas. Before Columbus. But there is a problem. A very large one. The bottle gourd was already in the Americas thousands of years before the Mali Empire existed. Genetic research suggests that its journey across the Atlantic happened in the distant prehistoric past. It may have been carried by people. It may have traveled naturally, helped by ocean currents. But whatever happened, it cannot tell us that a Malian fleet crossed the Atlantic in the 14th century. So the bottle gourd gives us an important lesson. Africa and the Americas were connected long before Columbus. But that does not mean Mali made the connection. The next clue is more mysterious. It is called guanín. Guanín was a valuable metal alloy used by indigenous peoples of the Caribbean. It contained gold, copper, and silver. To European observers, it was unusual. And because some of its metal composition could be compared with materials found elsewhere, later writers began asking whether it might have come from Africa. The idea is attractive. Perhaps African metalworkers produced objects that somehow crossed the Atlantic. Perhaps those objects were traded in the Caribbean. Perhaps they were connected to the missing expedition. But once again, the evidence becomes more complicated. Archaeological research has found strong evidence for indigenous production and exchange networks in the Americas. Guanín does not provide a secure fingerprint of Mali. There is no accepted archaeological chain showing Mali Atlantic Caribbean. So guanín remains what it is. A genuine pre-Columbian material. An important part of Caribbean history. But not proof that Malian sailors arrived there. And this is becoming a pattern. A clue appears. It looks promising. Then we examine the date, the location, the technology, the archaeological context, and the connection becomes weaker. This does not mean we should throw away the investigation. It means we should become more careful. Because if we are going to make a claim as extraordinary as a medieval Malian expedition reaching another continent, the evidence has to do more than simply look interesting. It has to connect. The object has to be from the right period. It has to be from the right place. And there must be a credible route connecting it to Mali. So far, we have not found that connection. But there is another clue. And this one is different. It does not come from a plant. It does not come from a piece of metal. It comes from a story about people. A report from the age of Columbus describes people who were said to be black and who were associated with lands to the south. For some researchers, this is one of the most intriguing pieces of the puzzle. If those people were Africans, it could change the entire debate. But were they? What exactly did the original report say? Who gave the information? How was it translated? And what did the people who recorded it actually mean when they described someone as black? Those questions matter. Because a single word written down by a European observer centuries ago cannot, by itself, identify an entire population. So the investigation moves forward. The plants have given us a possibility. The metal has given us a question. And now a human report appears to offer something even more intriguing. But before we decide who those people were, we need to hear what Columbus's sources actually said. Chapter 6. The people Columbus heard about. There is another clue in this story. And this one involves people. More than a century after the reported Molian expedition, Christopher Columbus crossed the Atlantic. When he arrived in the Caribbean, he encountered indigenous societies that had been living there for generations. The people he met were not waiting for Europe to give them a history. They had their own communities, political systems, beliefs, farming traditions, and knowledge of the sea. The Taino, among others, were skilled navigators who lived across much of the Caribbean. But during his voyages, Columbus also recorded information that later became part of another mystery. According to an account associated with his third voyage, Columbus wanted to investigate a report from the people of Hispaniola. They had told him that black people had supposedly come to the island from the south and southeast. The visitors were said to have carried spear points made from a metal called guanín. Columbus reportedly sent samples of the metal to Spain for examination. The reported analysis described an alloy containing gold, silver, and copper. For those searching for evidence of an African voyage to the Americas, this sounds important. Perhaps these were Africans. Perhaps they had arrived by sea. Perhaps they were connected to the mysterious expedition from West Africa. But there is a problem. The report does not tell us who these people were. And that distinction is crucial. The word black does not automatically mean African. European observers use color descriptions in different ways. And the people being described were not necessarily identified according to the racial categories we use today. In fact, when Columbus first encountered the Taino, his own descriptions did not portray them as black Africans. He described their complexion in comparison with people from the Canary Islands and with sunburned Europeans. So the report cannot simply be treated as proof that Africans had arrived in the Caribbean. There is another problem. The account comes from a European source describing information that had already been passed from indigenous people to Columbus. That gives us several layers between the original event and the surviving record. An indigenous person tells a European explorer something. The explorer interprets it. The information is recorded. Later historians translate and interpret the record again. By the time we read it today, we are several steps removed from the people who supposedly witnessed the event. That does not make the report worthless. But it means we have to be careful. And there is something else we must remember. Africans really did arrive in the Americas during the European colonial period. There are historical records of people of African ancestry accompanying early Spanish expeditions, including individuals connected with Columbus's voyages. But that is a different story. We are looking for evidence of pre-Columbian African contact. And for that, the date matters. If an African person arrived with Columbus or shortly afterward, it tells us nothing about the Molian expedition. We need evidence from before 1492. That is why the report from Hispaniola is so interesting. It appears to describe a possible earlier arrival. But possible is the key word. There is no established archaeological trail connecting these reported visitors to Mali. No inscription identifies them as Malian. No surviving shipwreck has been securely linked to the expedition. No accepted genetic evidence identifies a medieval Malian population in the Caribbean. And the metal itself does not provide the missing connection. So we are left with a fascinating report. But not a proven African arrival. Still, one question remains. If people really had crossed the Atlantic from Africa and reached the Americas before Columbus, where is the physical evidence? Where are the objects? Where are the settlements? Where are the tools, inscriptions, graves, or unmistakable traces of their presence? That is the test we can no longer avoid. Because stories can travel across centuries. But objects can sometimes tell a different story. And now we have to search for Moli's footprint in the archaeological record. Chapter 7. Where is the evidence? The story has brought us a long way. We have followed the ruler who reportedly wanted to explore the Western Ocean. We have watched his first expedition disappear. We have followed the Second Fleet as it sailed west. We have established that Atlantic currents could make a westward journey physically possible. And we have examined the clues that have been used to argue for contact between Africa and the Americas. But now we have to ask the hardest question. Where is the evidence? Because possibility is not proof. If thousands of people really crossed the Atlantic from Mali and reached the Americas, we should expect them to leave some trace. Perhaps an object. Perhaps a settlement. Perhaps a tool. Perhaps an inscription. Perhaps human remains. Perhaps something that could be securely dated to before 1492 and linked to West Africa. That is the standard we have to apply. And this is where the story becomes much more difficult. The first problem is archaeology. Researchers have searched for evidence of pre-Columbian contact between Africa and the Americas. But no generally accepted archaeological discovery has established a Malian presence in the Americas before Columbus. That does not mean nobody has ever claimed to find such evidence. There have been many claims. African-looking figures in ancient American art. Words that supposedly resemble West African languages. Metal objects said to resemble African technology. Stories of Africans arriving before Columbus. And even theories that African visitors influenced major American civilizations. But claims are not enough. An artifact must come from a secure archaeological context. Its age must be established. Its origin must be investigated. And there must be a credible connection between the object and the people we are claiming brought it there. This is especially important because some of the most famous claims about African visitors to the Americas have been strongly challenged by archaeologists. Studies of the supposed African influence on the Olmec civilization, for example, have found no genuine African artifact from a controlled archaeological excavation that establishes such contact. That matters. Because the Americas had their own sophisticated civilizations, their own artists, their own engineers, their own traders, their own religious traditions, their own systems of government. We should not take an indigenous achievement and automatically give its origin to someone from another continent simply because a resemblance appears interesting. So where does that leave Mali? The archaeological record does not currently give us the answer we are looking for. There is no accepted Malian settlement in pre-Columbian America. No securely identified Malian inscription. No confirmed Malian shipwreck. No unmistakable collection of 14th-century West African artifacts demonstrating that a Malian expedition arrived and established itself in the Americas. And there is another problem. If the expedition really involved thousands of people and resulted in lasting contact, the absence of a clear archaeological footprint becomes harder to ignore. But we also have to be fair. The absence of evidence is not the same thing as proof that something never happened. Ships can sink. Wood can decay. Small groups can disappear. Objects can be lost. And archaeological evidence is never complete. So we cannot honestly say, no artifact has been found, therefore the voyage never happened. That goes too far. But we can say something else. The evidence we currently possess does not allow us to say that the fleet reached America. That distinction is critical. The medieval source gives us a story of an expedition. Oceanography tells us that a westward crossing was physically possible. The bottle gourd proves that Africa and the Americas had an ancient biological connection, but thousands of years before Mali. Guanín is real and important to Caribbean history, but it does not provide a secure Malian fingerprint. Archaeological research has documented guanín within indigenous Caribbean metalworking and exchange networks. And the Columbus era report about people described as black remains intriguing, but ambiguous. None of these pieces, individually or together, currently provides the missing archaeological bridge. And this brings us to an uncomfortable truth. There are two mistakes we can make with African history. The first is to underestimate it. To assume that medieval Africans could not have imagined, attempted, or achieved extraordinary things. The second is to overstate it. To take every unexplained object, every old story, and every resemblance as proof of an African achievement. Both mistakes distort history. The first makes Africa smaller than it was. The second makes the evidence weaker than it is. The African archive should do neither. We should allow the mystery to remain a mystery. Because there is still one question we have not answered. Perhaps the ships never made it across the ocean. Perhaps they reached land but never returned. Perhaps some people survived somewhere beyond Molly's knowledge. Or perhaps the story itself changed as it traveled from one generation to another. The evidence cannot yet tell us which explanation is correct. But it can tell us what we cannot honestly claim. We cannot say that Molly discovered America. Not yet. And if history has left us with a mystery rather than an answer, perhaps the most honest thing we can do is resist the temptation to invent one. The ships disappeared. The evidence remains incomplete. But the question is still waiting for an answer. And now, we have to decide what the evidence allows us to believe. Chapter 8. What happened to the fleet? We have followed the story as far as the surviving evidence allows. A Molian ruler reportedly sent a fleet into the Atlantic. The first expedition disappeared. A second, much larger expedition followed. This time, the ruler went with it. And then he disappeared too. Centuries later, Mansa Musa told the story. Aluma recorded it. And that is where the historical trail begins to fade. So what actually happened? There are several possibilities. The first is also the simplest. The fleet may have disappeared at sea. The Atlantic can be unforgiving. Storms can destroy ships. Ships can become separated. Food and fresh water can run out. A damaged vessel can become impossible to control. And even if one ship survives, finding its way back to West Africa would be another challenge. A fleet can disappear without ever reaching another continent. That possibility should not be dismissed simply because it is less exciting. But there is another possibility. The expedition may have reached land somewhere in the Atlantic. There are islands scattered across the ocean. A ship carried by wind and currents does not necessarily travel in a straight line. Some members of the expedition could theoretically have reached an island or distant coastline. But once again, we have no accepted evidence showing that this happened. And then there is the possibility that has made this story famous. Perhaps some of the ships reached the Americas. The Atlantic currents make such a journey physically possible. The Americas were certainly connected to the rest of the world long before European colonization. But physical possibility is not enough. We need evidence showing that these particular people made that journey. And so far, that evidence has not been found. There is also another possibility that deserves attention. Perhaps the story changed as it was passed down. Remember how little we know about the ruler himself. The name Abu Bakr too is uncertain. The numbers associated with the fleet come from a historical account written after the events. The story reached Aluma through people connected to Mansa Musa's account. That does not make it false. But it reminds us that historical information can change as it travels. Numbers can become larger. Details can disappear. A real expedition can become surrounded by legend. And a story that begins with a genuine event can eventually contain details that we can no longer verify. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with something much more interesting than a simple yes or no. We can say with confidence that the story of a Molian Atlantic expedition was recorded in the medieval period. We can say that the Atlantic was physically capable of carrying vessels from West Africa toward the Americas. We can say that Africa and the Americas had connections that existed long before Columbus. Although some of those connections began thousands of years before the Mali Empire. We can also say that several popular claims about African contact with pre-Columbian America do not provide the proof they are often said to provide. And most importantly, we cannot honestly say that Mali reached America before Columbus. There is not enough evidence. That may disappoint some people. But history is not supposed to give us the answer we want. It is supposed to give us the answer the evidence can support. And that is where this story becomes bigger than the question of America. Because perhaps the most important thing about the vanished expedition is not where it ended. It is what the decision to launch it tells us about the people who lived in medieval West Africa. A powerful ruler looked toward an ocean he could not see beyond. He wanted to know what was there. He was willing to risk ships, supplies, and eventually his own life to find out. That is not the story of a continent waiting for someone else to introduce it to the wider world. It is the story of people making their own decisions, pursuing their own questions, and trying to understand the world around them. Perhaps the ship sank. Perhaps they reached somewhere unknown. Perhaps the story became larger with every generation that repeated it. We simply do not know. And after centuries, that uncertainty may be the most honest conclusion we have. Molly's ships sailed west. History lost sight of them. And somewhere beyond the horizon, the answer may still be waiting. Epilogue. The horizon remains. History is often remembered through the things we can prove. A city that still stands. A document that survives. A grave. A monument. A name carved into stone. But sometimes, history leaves us with something different. A question. More than 7 centuries ago, a ruler of Mali reportedly looked toward the Atlantic and decided that the world beyond the horizon was worth searching for. He sent ships west. The first expedition disappeared. Then he sent another. And this time, he went with them. He never returned. We do not know where he died. We do not know where his ships ended. And we do not know whether any of them ever reached the Americas. The evidence we have examined does not allow us to say that Molly discovered America before Columbus. The bottle gourd does not prove it. Guanín does not prove it. The reports of people described as black do not prove it. And the absence of a confirmed Malian archaeological footprint means the claim remains unproven. But there is something else we should not lose in our search for proof. The mystery itself comes from a historical record. An African ruler really was remembered as someone who wanted to push beyond the known world. His expedition was important enough for the story to reach Mansour Musa. And important enough for Aluma to record it. That alone tells us something about medieval Africa. The people of Mali were not simply watching history happen somewhere else. They were living inside their own world of ambition, trade, scholarship, faith, politics, and exploration. They asked questions. They took risks. They made decisions that sometimes succeeded. And sometimes disappeared without an answer. Perhaps that is why this story still speaks to us. Not because we can confidently say that Molly reached America. But because a man once stood at the edge of the known world and refused to believe that the horizon was the end. He wanted to know what was beyond it. So he sent his ships west. And then the ocean swallowed the story. Maybe one day archaeology will tell us more. Maybe a shipwreck will be found. Maybe an object will emerge from the earth or the sea with a story no historian expected. Or maybe nothing will ever be discovered. Maybe the ships are gone forever. For now, we have to live with the uncertainty. And perhaps that is where this story should end. Not with a claim. Not with a legend presented as fact. But with a horizon. Because every civilization has its horizons. The places it knows. The places it fears. And the places it dares to explore. For one ruler in medieval Mali, the Atlantic was one of those places. He sailed toward it. And history lost sight of him. But his question remains. What lies beyond the horizon? And perhaps that is the part of the story we can still carry with us. The ships are gone. The evidence is incomplete. But the horizon remains. If you want to discover more stories of Africa's people, kingdoms, struggles, and forgotten achievements, subscribe to the African Archive. And stay with us as we continue searching the past for the stories history left behind. This is the African Archive.